Welcome to the recorded version of Bridging the Family Communication Gap from February 19th, 2020. Brought to you by the American Society on Aging and a generous sponsorship from Right at Home.
Okay, our presenter today is Ebony Green. Ebony is a registered nurse and family caregiver. Ebony has extensive experience focused on caregivers' health and wellness with an emphasis on caregiver stress, burnout, and related family conflicts. She works with caregiving communities to teach the importance of self-care while caring for someone you love. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor and the presentation over to Ebony Green. Welcome, Ebony.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome everyone. I am excited to have this opportunity to speak with you today about a very important topic, and I'm always appreciative of the support that Right at Home provides to ensure that caregivers have access to valuable resources and information. So today I'm going to talk to you about one of the more important aspects of providing care for a loved one, and that is effective communication. And I'd like to begin with a poem. I tend to like to share a little something to get us warmed up. And I'm going to share a poem called I Ask Because I Care. I ask because I care and I don't want to assume. My assumptions are frequently incorrect. When I think she's old and frail, these are not her thoughts. I assume she needs my help, is dependent for assistance, can't make it without continuous supervision. These are not her thoughts. When I feel roles have reversed, she knows nothing has changed but the pace at which she runs this race. When I am thinking it must be done yet today, she knows that what you don't finish today will be waiting tomorrow. When I believe I have found a cure, when I think I'm saying something new, I know more today than yesterday. I assume that I know what's best. My perceptions must be correct. She thinks I sure wish she would ask me. Indeed, we should, instead of assuming, clarify everything, give ourselves and others permission to ask for what they need. I think this is one of the most important aspects of what we'll be chatting about today, is to acknowledge that our loved ones are maybe needing additional assistance, but they're still coming to us with a wealth of knowledge and experiences, and our conversations really are to be centered on what their needs are. So the four objectives that we have today are to assemble a person-centered and family-centered care conversation that incorporates collaborative strategies and best practices to improve health outcomes and to enhance the quality of life for you and your loved one. We also want to identify when it's necessary to refocus the conversation so that siblings and other relatives are guided to put their differences aside to focus on the care of your loved one. And I know this is one of the more challenging aspects of things. I hope to be able to provide some personal examples that might help to guide you through these types of turbulent conversations. I'd also like to talk about provide you with tools to empower you to document your loved one's care preferences. And then we want to make sure that these preferences are integrated as a part of the collaborative care plan and communicated within the healthcare team. I think that sometimes gets overlooked, that if it's not documented and communicated within the health team, then we're going to be at cross purposes, and that's never our goal. There are four key considerations for effective communication. I'm sure there are other things that we might consider, but these are really the main things that I've found to be true. Number one is the single most important approach to improving communication is listening. And sometimes that means you have to really quiet your mind so that you're being an active listener rather than thinking about what your response might be. If your relationship with your loved one is already strained, creating an environment for open communication will likely be difficult, but it's possible. I'm sure that there will be questions about what do you do when you have siblings where you've already had a sibling rivalry or there's communication that's lacking within families. How do you overcome those types of difficult situations? And it's not easy. Every care situation is unique, so we want to make sure that we respect the exclusivity of our circumstances. And then don't place pressure on yourself to have the talk. We want to have conversations that are ongoing. So it's ultimately not about what you want or even what you think is best for your loved one. That can be hard, but you want to preserve your loved one's autonomy and make sure that their safety supersedes your personal preferences. An excellent quote by Benjamin Mays, he says, honest communication is built on truth and integrity and upon respect of one for the other. So a solid plan for effective communication can definitely enhance your experience as a caregiver. Now, these are some interesting and compelling statistics about conversations. And so we look at the communication wishes. So 60% of individuals who were surveyed said that they having important decisions made up front is important. And however, 56% have not communicated their wishes to family members or their primary physician. That's a challenge. If you have different conversations with different family members, there can be great deals of miscommunication and disagreement because one family member was told one thing and another. So having things documented is vitally important. Wishes in writing, 82% say that it is important to put your wishes in writing, but only 23% have actually done so. And then 80% want to talk to their doctor if they're seriously ill, and only 7% have talked to their doctor. So I think it's important to think about how we can better, as care providers and then also as professionals, how we can make sure that we are encouraging individuals, if they have questions, to set up a consult visit, maybe to talk about conditions and treatments. Otherwise, it really feels like things can be very rushed. And then 50% or nearly 50% of doctors are unsure about how to discuss end of life with patients. And so I think that's the other side of the coin, that we may be uncomfortable, but physicians and other care providers might not be used to having these types of conversations either. So the National Alliance for Caregiving and AARP had some really interesting notes, and they say that these conversations are not occurring for a majority of caregivers, even when these groups are likely to discuss these things with healthcare providers. In fact, when we compare the percentage of caregivers who report having these kinds of conversations with the percentage of caregivers who would find these conversations helpful, the need gap we see, the need is greater than what is being reported by caregivers. So conversations about recipient care, there's a gap, a 6% gap, and while there's a 10% gap for conversations about self-care. So we really need to make sure that we are encouraging these types of conversations. And this is from the AARP, National Alliance and AARP study from 2015 that we all rely on so much. They're great information that they put out. Possible reasons why so few caregivers have had a care conversation. Well, most of us are not sure how to broach the topic, so it's nerve-wracking. We can also be afraid of overstepping boundaries. Maybe you're not aware of what your loved one needs or that they even need assistance. And then a lot of us are really busy, children, adult children, caring for parents. And so you may not be thinking about it until there's actually a scenario that occurs that's an emergency. And I'll talk about what can occur there in just a moment. But I just wonder if anyone is at all surprised about why we have so few conversations. I would think that we wouldn't be, that this is kind of a common thing. So one of the times where I see that people maybe, caregivers and families maybe do have more of a conversation, or we hope that they do, is during care transitions. But this is not an ideal time to have this type of conversation, because the foundation information that you need is not going to be readily available. In the last couple of years, my husband and I have cared for a number of family members, including his dad and his mom. And in his mom's most recent situation, she got a case of the flu. And she's only in her 60s, but had some major chronic illnesses. She got the flu and didn't go to the doctor. And when we finally got her to the emergency room, she was really, really, really sick and was placed on the ventilator and was unconscious for a while. And so there was a difference of opinion between my husband's grandmother and us adult children. Grandma said that mom wouldn't want to be on the ventilator and would be ready to go. And the rest of us said, no, she wouldn't. This is going to give her an opportunity to recover. And we went through about a year-long recovery with her. She had a stroke and whatnot after that. So it was very stressful during the time that she was at the hospital. And I think the only reason why we were able to kind of work through that situation with mom was because of a mutual respect, and because grandma does trust me for medical decision making. And so, but it was tense, and I had to do a lot of mediating between the nurses and grandma. So I just think that when you have these care transitions, everyone's emotions are high. And so had we had an opportunity to really sit down and work through what she would want in various situations, it might not have been so challenging. Barriers to effective communication following a medical crisis. Caregivers feel that health providers could do a better job of engaging them in important care conversations or conversations about care. It's very busy if you're in the hospital or long-term care setting and you're making a transition maybe from the hospital to an acute, long-term acute center to a long-term care center. That's a lot. And so sometimes family members feel left out of the loop, and unless you actually sit down and have time to participate in the care plan meetings, you may be missing out on a lot of the goals and your involvement in goal setting. Caregivers perceive the lack of an organized process and surmise that it leads to poor quality of care. We know that because we all need to be involved. Communication and information sharing are often major challenges, particularly for patients who require multidisciplinary care. So when you have different providers who are coming in at different times, for example, mom needed speech and physical therapy, and she needed those types of things when she was in the acute setting and then transferred over to the long-term care center before we could bring her home. It's a lot to manage. Family caregivers may not be able to initially recognize or assume the care responsibilities surrounding the transition from hospital to home. I'll share how we did it, but it was hard. It was not an easy transition. So these are some communication barriers that, continuing on communication barriers, family caregivers contribute to the care needs of their loved one. And these unfold on a spectrum where the readiness and willingness and ability of both parties is often dynamic. With my father-in-law, he was diagnosed with lung cancer and ended up going on hospice and passed away. But I remember the conversation we had about his care needs and his decision to go on hospice and the challenges that we had with talking with the rest of the family members in getting us to all agree on what was best for him. So it can be really challenging when you're trying to have these conversations in the heat of the moment when there's a major health condition that's happening or health crisis. Family caregivers have unique and potentially incongruent goals from those of their loved one. So we all wanted, especially mom, who'd been with her husband for 40 some odd years. She wanted him to fight, and he knew that that wasn't going to be the best outcome for him, that he would be in less pain if he were to go with the hospice care. And it was difficult to convince her of that decision, or to get her to support that decision. Family caregivers need encouragement to assert their role identity. So to advocate within the healthcare system can be challenging. And family caregivers often assume the responsibility for sequencing of post-hospital care plan tasks. Oh my goodness. Depending on the needs, that can be really a challenge. So I want to share some tips with you for bridging the communication gap. So these tips I think are most relevant to any stage of the caregiving process. But if you know that you will likely be the primary caregiver, having a few conversations even now can be helpful. I'm an only child, and thankfully my stepmother, she is a doctor, and but my mother too, I'm the oldest for my mom, and so it's very difficult. My dad is ex-Marine, and so it's very difficult for me to get any information from him, but I do have an ally in my stepmom, who is a wonderful person. So you want to gather accurate and relevant information. So one of the resources that you will likely want to access that will be very helpful for you in having the conversations, and also with documentation, is the Right Conversations Guide. And these tips are highlighted in that guide in more detail, but there are also accompanying documents that can help you figure out what is accurate and relevant information. And this is something that you can keep together so that as you have different care transitions, you have that information handy. So things like Social Security or Medicaid card, or birth dates, where certain things are, life insurance plans or policies. There are places on the guide that you can include all of that information. Whenever you are starting to have conversations, you might want to determine the level of need that is, or concern that is warranted. And this can kind of help you prioritize what are the needs of my loved one. So right now, my dad had some challenges with his heart. He's doing a lot better, but initially it was just basically getting him back to being able to function normally every day. He wasn't able to walk even 10 to 12 steps, and has been a very healthy man his entire life. So that's very frustrating. So really just being able to prioritize what he needed, and to have maybe assistance while he was in that acute stage. And so that was how we were kind of able to prioritize things. Review facts and avoid personal biases, because we all have different opinions about what our loved ones might need. We want to listen to what their ideas are about what their needs are. And then you may make suggestions, but then also recognize they may not be immediately taken. So there may be some opposition. So sibling discussions can be particularly challenging. And so we want to talk a little bit about involving siblings. I find this to be one of the most challenging things or aspects of having conversations, is getting siblings involved, even when they don't live in your immediate community. And sometimes if you're the adult child who lives in the community, one of your siblings who does not live there, the emergency of the need, or the urgency of the need, to say that a little better, is not necessarily recognized. And so having a loved one, your sibling, come in and actually see what's happening can make all the difference in the world to getting everyone on the same page. But again, if there have been sibling rivalries and difficult relationships in the past, this may be one of the more challenging aspects. And then you have to kind of weigh whether or not it's going to be easier to have your siblings involved personally in the care, or would you prefer to ask them to do things that are maybe more financial in nature or more intermittent? And so I'm going to give you some tools to help with that too. But getting siblings involved from the start, I feel, is one of the most important things. So if we miss that opportunity, it may be that you're down the road quite a ways, and now you're feeling exhausted and burned out, and resentful because everything is on you. When having siblings, if possible, involved at the beginning, could make it so that it is an expectation. With our family, with mom and grandma, with mom and dad, what we ended up doing is my husband left the workforce for a year while my father-in-law was really ill, and so that he could do the majority of the managing of his care. And then he was able to guide his care, and he's respected by his siblings, and so that was very effective. With mom, it was mom, so everyone, the siblings, we all wanted to be involved. There's been some changes in our relationships since mom passed away about 1.5 years ago, and so we're all here to care for grandmother, but it's different. Everyone is not as close, and so sometimes we find that we're doing more of the day-to-day, and I think we're okay with that, but it might, we don't know how that might turn out down the road. Diffusing sibling rivalry, so trying to be the peacemaker. This sounds like something that I could suggest that might not be very easy, but if you remember to focus the needs on mom or dad, then it's for that particular aspect of things. So we're not talking about all the old things that drove us crazy or drive us crazy about our siblings, but to just specifically focus on the needs of our loved one and keep the relationship and the conversation focused there. And sometimes that means you have to listen more than talking, which can be really challenging. It's an acquired skill, but it can be very helpful to redirect conversations. Rather than maybe turning down someone's suggestion, maybe listing out all of the suggested solutions. And that way you have everyone's ideas written down, and you can kind of decipher what's going to work best as a group. Encourage a family meeting. So can we chat about this further? Also, encourage your siblings to actually go through the conversation guide and accompanying resources and fill out the information for themselves. That is very important. We have done that in our family so that we don't have the situation with mom occurring with other family members. And then try to avoid volcanic confrontations in front of your aging parent. That really can place a lot of burden on your family members. So you definitely want to make sure that if there are disagreements, perhaps have another time away from mom and dad and discuss those differences in a different setting privately. We also want to let bygones be bygones. Some things are just not going to change. And so you just really have to go along with what you can do that's going to be best for your parent, and and I have experienced this from my husband and siblings. And so you just really have to, again, refocus and maintain the focus on your parent or loved one, grandparent. Don't forget to seek out professional services. So if applicable, you could complete a Google or Bing search for local services like case managers and mediators. You also might use social media groups. I find a lot of really great resources on the LinkedIn group. There's a home care and advocacy group that I belong to. There's always really good conversations. Sometimes I go and I find things and I basically copy the link and I can go back to them when I have more time to really focus. But sibling related topics, you'd be surprised at how many other people are experiencing similar situations to yours. And so having an ability to vent or get resources or tips, ideas from others can be very helpful. So I do suggest planning the conversation, but I really suggest not over planning the conversation. So making sure that, and this is what I mean by that, is the first time that you sit down and talk. We don't want to bombard our loved one with a whole host of ideas and suggestions. Sometimes during the beginning of changing needs, our loved ones will just want to vent, and they may not be ready for services or solutions. And that's okay. You're kind of doing what we would call planting seeds. And so you're being a good listener and you are listening to what the major concerns are. And then when you feel like it's time to kind of bring it up, you may have an opportunity to say, well, this would be a great service and it would be helpful if you use the service because it would help me to be able to do more of the personal things that we do. I hear a lot of family caregivers say, especially when you're in the trenches, that they want to be the daughter or the son or the grandchild. They don't want to be thought of just as the caregiver, which is an important role. But I understand that there's a relationship that already exists. And so you're building on and enjoying that aspect of things. And when we have to put in all of these additional tasks and worries about the condition and the services that our loved one may need, it can make you feel like you're not necessarily focusing on that authentic part of your relationship. So planning for the conversation and letting your loved one know that when you do make suggestions for services, that this is going to make things easier for you so you don't burn out, and it's going to help to continue to nurture that relationship as a son or a daughter or a grandchild. We want it to be positive. So we want to talk about, I always like to do the sandwich method where you talk about something that's positive that's happening. I see you're making progress here. We need to continue working on transferring from the bed to the toilet if we are going to get home, but I know we can do that so that we can get you home. So, in sandwiching things in that type of a way so that it's not all about what are the unmet needs of your loved one can be very helpful. No one wants to feel like they are not able to do things for themselves. You'll also find in the communication guide, the Right Conversation Guide, you'll find these different styles of communication, and they're really helpful for one tip or one idea of how you can kind of pivot if you have someone who is more assertive, or you have someone who's reserved, who doesn't necessarily say anything during the conversations that you're having. They're maybe less participative, and so you really want to try to encourage them to get involved, because by sharing their ideas and getting involved in the conversations that you're having, you're getting buy-in there too. So I would really encourage you to refer back to these 7 tips about how to overcome specific communication styles. And then to also identify who might be the more rational person who could help talk you through more challenging conversations, or who's maybe the person who's more assertive, so they don't mind asking the doctor specific questions that maybe other family members might be less comfortable with. So these communication styles can be helpful not only for your conversations that you're having, but also for your conversations and positioning loved ones to be advocates in certain ways. If you have somebody who is more composed, maybe they're the person to talk to guide the conversation when everyone is more overwhelmed, so you kind of lean to them. So this can be helpful, and do share it with your siblings or those of who you're providing care with. This is kind of interesting. I mentioned that my dad and I went through a situation, and I mentioned that he's a Marine, and he's in his 70s now. And a few years ago, maybe about 6 years ago now, he got some type of a virus. My stepmom was still working in practice, and so she was exposed to some type of virus, and the virus basically attacked his heart. And so I just remember being very concerned at the time. They live in West Virginia, so it's quite far. I'm in Nebraska. And I remember calling, and I just felt like I just needed to call him and check on him. So I called, and I was all nervous and jittery about, what's going on. And I was talking to my mother-in-law, my stepmother, and she said, "Oh, everything is fine, and don't worry." And they call me the baby. I'm in my 40s. But she didn't necessarily tell me that later on. Well, what happened was later on, my uncle posted something in the on Facebook, and it was of my dad. And my dad had been life flighted from where they were currently living to the Cleveland Clinic. And I was like, oh my goodness, I just talked to them, and he said that he was fine, and for me not to worry. And so I was really concerned and called back and was like, why didn't you guys tell me? And so what ended up happening was, of course, I called and I was like, what's the deal here, parents? And they just didn't want to burden me. And I said, I'm comfortable enough with, I'm in the medical field and whatnot, and I'm comfortable enough to deal with whatever the situation is. He's fine now, but he's the dad, and so he doesn't necessarily want to tell me when there are serious health conditions and situations that are occurring, and so that can be really hard. And so some elders don't feel comfortable sharing their personal information with their adult children, and part of it is not wanting to burden. My dad is, we call him Superman, so he didn't want to tell me that information, and he didn't really want to share it with others either. And then if you consider the fact that it's not always the spouse or parent or partner, that it can be children and adults and siblings. So things that you may tell your spouse might not be things that you want to necessarily share with neighbors and friends. And so that's kind of what that pie chart from caregiving in the U.S. Is about. One of the things I really love about this Right Conversations guide and really felt strongly about is, if you are in the profession and you have to have conversations with families, there's not always a guide of what you might say. And so in the Right Conversations, there is a step-by-step guide that kind of gives you ideas about how you might open, how you might have the conversation, how you might redirect. And of course, it's not something that you would necessarily have there when you're I won't say have. It's not something that you would necessarily read verbatim when you're having a conversation, but it does give you ideas if you are a professional or if you are a sibling and you want to have a conversation, how to kind of really guide that conversation back to the needs of your loved one that you're providing care for. So easy for these things to get off track. And then try to avoid feeling discouraged when your loved one says no. My husband and I kind of have a thing where I might have a new idea, and when we were young, he's a person who generally is going to say no first, and that used to drive me crazy. But it has gotten me to understand, has allowed me to understand that just because I've been thinking over something, and I'm a thinker, so I think, that doesn't mean that the person that I'm presenting my idea to has had an opportunity to absorb and think about what might be best. So just because you've had that opportunity, remember that when you're presenting something, your loved one may not have had that same opportunity. And so really, if you keep that in mind, it will help you to avoid becoming discouraged. You also want to maintain your focus on what you've achieved. Okay, so my dad didn't tell me about this care situation, but now that he understands how important it is for me to know what's going on, he's more communicative about those needs. Focus on the goal and not the barriers. Like, I know that he or she is going to say this or that. Most of us know our parents, our spouses very well. And so you know what that potential barrier is going to be. That doesn't mean that you don't present it. Because again, give them an opportunity to absorb what you've actually said and mull it over. And maybe there's going to be an adjustment, and maybe it's still going to be no. Again, considering that your loved one was unprepared, consider taking a step back, so giving that person the time to process, and then celebrate the successes that you do have along the way. For those really challenging times, you may need to reach out to a mediator. And I have a great article that there were a couple of mediators that really work with families that shared some excellent tips with me. And I'm going to see if I can put that in the chat maybe. But I think you would really benefit from what they do and how they can keep things focused, because sometimes the gap is too great and it would be too much pressure for you to try to overcome and keep things focused. And they say it can be really challenging, but that it can be done. So you may need to reach out to a mediator if you feel like you need someone to really guide the conversation and make sure that you are accomplishing what you set out to accomplish. So one of the things that I like to do when I have an opportunity to present this in person, and we'll do this, and we'll share the resources with you, because this can be so effective for just getting an idea of how you might begin a conversation. So what I normally will do is I have these care scenarios, and I'm going to, and then I also have a caregiver strengths assessment. And what the caregiver strengths assessment is a set of questions, and the questions focus on things like emergency management, meal planning, lawn care, documentation. What are your caregiver-related inner strengths? And so you answer the questionnaire, and then you identify where you scored the highest, and maybe there's 3 areas, the top 3 areas, and then those are the things that you, or if you do sit down and do this activity with your siblings, you or your siblings are most comfortable with doing. It really opens the door, because what I see sometimes is, for example, with mom, when it was time for personal cares or medication or talking to the doctor, I'm very comfortable with that. My husband is more comfortable with maybe more planning, documentation, talking to the social workers about the financial management of things. And grandma was more comfortable with the companionship. And my siblings were more comfortable with doing things like running errands. So if you're able to do things, find what your strengths are as a caregiver, as they relate to caregiving, and then focus on what your loved one needs and how your caregiver's strength relates to that, and then assign those duties so that no one is doing things that they're uncomfortable with, if possible. And then where there are gaps, are you able to hire someone to come in home or to do meal preparation or for socialization, that type of thing? So what I usually will do is have a scenario. And then after going through that scenario, you will have already written down your inner strengths. And like I said, Steve is going to share this with you, a care scenario, your inner strengths assessment or questionnaire, and you'll identify those areas. And then there's the family action planner, and he'll share that with you as well. So if you go to the second page of the family action planner, the actual needs of your loved one, like meal preparation, medication management, they're all listed on the back of that action planner. And so you could really schedule a time for your siblings to sit around with your parent, talk about what are the unmet needs, conduct a very quick inner strengths assessment, and then flip over the action planner and write down who might do what. This gets everybody involved, but it also ensures that the things that you're asking your family members to do are more of their natural strengths. So again, my husband wouldn't feel comfortable doing personal cares. I would. I'm a nurse. It's something that I don't mind doing, and sometimes I feel like I want to do it because I know it'll be done right. That would take him really out of his personal preferences and may make him uncomfortable, and that leads to burnout often. So definitely download those when they become available and practice. I think it'll be very helpful. And if you're a care provider, this is a great way to kind of guide your staff and yourself through what could be a good exercise for communication. And then after you have a conversation, don't forget to summarize what you talked about, to assign homework. Remember, everything is not going to be done within the one meeting. You want to continue gathering information. If you join a group that has some good tips and information, like the healthcare advocacy group, don't forget to share that with your siblings or your care team, those that are involved in the care team. Plan a follow-up visit. We know that our loved ones' needs are going to likely change, and so that means the things that we provide are going to likely change. And then don't forget to reach out for assistance when necessary. And I feel like that's one of the more challenging things to do, is to get folks to reach out for assistance, but to know that that is necessary. And I don't think I have on here, but I would say to make sure that you take care of yourself. So, that hot bath that you need to take each night, or getting respite care so you can go on a trip and not worry about mom, or going to your support group, or having your online support group that you belong to. Whatever it is that you need to do to care for yourself, even just having a series of conversations can be very stressful. So pat yourself on the back for making it this far, and be good to yourself too.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ebony. We do appreciate you joining us for this great conversation today about communication. Speaking of communication, if you want to communicate any questions, now is the time. Send in those questions for Ebony, and we will get to them here. And Ebony, if you are ready, we will get to the questions here. The first one for you.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on hiring someone to help facilitate family conversations?
I think that can be extremely effective. I really liked the mediators that I talked with, and there's like a whole association of mediators across the country, and so I can't remember the name of it, but it's a national mediators association, and so I think that can be effective and take the pressure off of the family to try to navigate the situation.
Okay. Next question, how do you find a mediator? Is this different than a case manager, and what are their credentials?
So, yes, they are different than case managers. There's actually a National Mediators Association. I could probably pop that into the chat. A lot of them are case managers, maybe have a more of a legal background. And then there's also specific training that they go through for becoming a mediator.
Okay. Next question, what is your suggestion on how to deal with third-party involvement? I feel like my parent doesn't tell me a lot because of his significant other. And then when something happens, she is surprised both my brother or myself didn't know anything. Basically, my question is how to talk to the third parties, stay out of it.
That's really hard. I think the first thing to try to do is to try to let the third party know. Like for example, when I was talking about my stepmother, we have a really close relationship, but they still did not tell me about my dad because they didn't feel like I could handle it. And so I think it can be really hard if there's not an existing relationship. And I knew that she was really doing that. I know her very well, so I know she really was doing that out of love and wanting to be protective. And so I would say the best bet may be to have in that situation to lean on a mediator for that type of scenario, but to let the person know that you definitely want to be involved in what's happening, and that you know it's all about centering your loved one or your parent. But that's very hard when there's that chasm there where you haven't had communication, you're not being let in on things.
Okay. Ebony, do you have any suggestions for how to get siblings on board who always have excuses for why they can't do more?
Yes, that's so frustrating. I would say having them involved from the start. I find that if that does not occur, it is so hard down the road. And then even when you're sitting there face to face and you're in tears and you're ready to throw up your hand, the person your brother or sister is removed from the situation, so they're not always hearing that you're saying, hey, this is a whole lot for me to do alone. And so I think if you haven't had them involved, I really do suggest having a meeting. And I do suggest doing the inner strengths questionnaire, because it's really non-threatening. And so you can say, see, being able to cook meals and bring cooked meals over here, that's a caregiving strength. So that could really help me. Or mowing the lawn, or being the person that shovels the snow. That might not be something that is personally involved in, you're not personally involved in doing this or that for mom, but that lightens the load on the caregiver, the primary caregiver. So I would say if you can, revisit it by having them, when they're in town next, do the questionnaire and talk about the needs of mom or dad, and show them that there are other things outside of maybe the things that you're doing that would lighten the load, that you wouldn't have to get a third party to come in and do. And sometimes that really does work. And you may have to do it on a consistent basis to remind them, I need this, that, or the other thing. And if that becomes too overwhelming, then perhaps you might need to, it might be best to hire someone to do those things and request that they help with covering the expenses.
Okay. Just a quick announcement, everybody. We did send out some links to some documents that Ebony provided: the Caregiver Inner Strength Questionnaire, Right Conversations Family Action Planner, and the Care Example document. We did post them up there, but we will also be sending them to you later on today in the follow-up email that you will receive. So we really want to get these important documents to you. We also are aware that the My Caregiver Support blogspot.com link was not working, so we'll get you the right link for that as well later on today in the follow-up email. So all those resources will be sent to you in the follow-up email. So just a quick announcement on that. Ebony, back to the questions here. How do you encourage self-care for someone who tends to find excuses for why they can't?
Oh, that's a hard one. I really think that, again, that sometimes what happens is we do say, take care, and then we don't necessarily provide examples of how an individual might do that. But if you have someone that you're encouraging, and it sounds like this person, the person who asked this question probably is giving suggestions. Sometimes what it relates to is being selfless. So I'm going to do all of these things and to care for my loved one, and my needs come way after. That is such a person is on the road to disaster for that. And so what we really want to do is to say, by doing these things for yourself, by taking your hot bath or having your glass of wine that's okay for you to have, or just going and sitting in your car and listening to your classical music, by doing whatever it is that you are doing, you are strengthening yourself to be able to care for mom or dad or, whomever they're caring for. Because what can happen is, we all know, and I'll just give a quick example, that I had a gentleman I was doing a caregiver assessment for, and he was caring for his wife with Alzheimer's. And we kept calling to set up an appointment to talk about how we could get him involved in his self-care. And he was, no. He kept pushing it out. And so we called, and the phone kept ringing. And finally, one day we got someone to answer the phone. It was his adult children who had come in town. He had actually passed away. He was caring for his wife with Alzheimer's. And his whole goal was to do the things that he was doing so she didn't have to go to a long-term care center. Well, his children didn't live in town, so they didn't have a real grasp on the things that were needed to care for his wife or for their mom. And so she ended up going to a long-term care facility, which was really what his goal was, that she would not be there. So sometimes it has to be really in stark terms that you caring for yourself is only going to enhance your longevity of caring for your loved one, and then just keep nagging.
Okay. Next question here. Ebony, how do you deal with communication problems between healthcare providers and family members?
I think that is another really important and challenging aspect. I know that when we were in the hospital with Mom, Grandma was very she was overwhelmed, and so she was not nice to the staff. And what I had to do was pull the staff over to the side and have a conversation with them and have them direct more things to me and my husband, because she would be very overwhelmed with that. So if you have a point person in the family that you can have them have the majority of the conversation, and then that information is disseminated through the family, maybe through, they get together for lunch or dinner and talk about the whole situation. That can be very helpful. The other thing is to make sure that someone is involved in what I would call a consult visit. I feel like when you go to the doctor or you're at the hospital, everything is so fast paced. If you set up a consult visit and maybe all the siblings go or the person that's going to be the spokesperson goes and they ask the questions but everybody else can listen. The consult visit is where you can just sit in the doctor's office, their actual office, in the chairs, and they're not doing a physical assessment or anything, and they have time to actually sit and answer your questions. I feel like sometimes that's the way that we get the best information. And then if you just feel like you have a healthcare team that is not listening, even though you've gone through these major adjustments and made these major adjustments to improve the communication, you might need to look at a different care provider. It's not always the family that's the challenge. It could be that the doctor maybe doesn't have skills in that area, or the nurse or the case manager. So always looking at other options if the consult doesn't move things forward.
Okay. Ebony, earlier in the presentation, you were talking about some social media groups and LinkedIn groups for support that you were mentioning. Can you give us the names of those groups so that people can access them?
Yes, there are some excellent groups. There is the Healthcare Home Health and Advocacy Group. So it's a very large group, and it has lots of folks posting things about caregiving. I also belong to the Dementia Care Group on LinkedIn. You can just put those names in for groups and you'll see them. There's also the National Family Caregiver Group that's still pretty active. Those are the main ones that I can think of right now.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What are the best ways to get a person being cared for to open up about health issues in early stages before the issues become a crisis, especially when the loved one always say they don't want to be a burden, but they end up in the ER or hospitalized?
Yes, that is one of the things that is very common. I still feel like if you can position the conversation to how this will help us, like your goal is to stay home. My goal is for you to stay home. You telling me when you are feeling bad or when your condition is changing or when you need help is going to help us achieve that goal, and it's going to help me reduce my stress. And I think you may have to say that over and over again, but I'd rather know now rather than or when you start to not feel well, so that I can be more proactive, and that's going to help us achieve your goal.
Okay. Just a couple resources here. Let's see. Sorry, I lost the question here. Okay, let's one more quick question here, Ebony. What happens if your loved one has advanced dementia but has never expressed clearly their end-of-life wishes in detail?
Then, for those situations, you really have to go with with the advice of the doctor and what you are witnessing and seeing, and do the best you can. I know that is one of those situations where when that happens, and that happened with my grandmother, Gran, she ended up having dementia, and a couple of us felt like she should be cared for in one way, and our uncle, who's the primary caregiver, did a wonderful job. But there was some differences of opinion, but Gran hadn't written anything down. And so he was the one that was providing the day-to-day care and making sure she was getting what she needs. So I respect that. And then he just did the best he could. And we just hope that there aren't long-term breaches in family relationships because the person who's the primary caregiver does what they think is best, but there are also other family members who have opinions. So it's very hard. It's very hard. That's why it's really important when you can, even now, to write things down and share them.
Okay. Well, Ebony, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our hour here, and it's time for us to wrap up. But I want to thank you for joining us today for this great presentation, a very important topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You know, I could always talk another hour.